If you've used a reasoning model through an API in the last year, you've paid for tokens you were never allowed to read. The invoice itemizes them, the response doesn't contain them. Anthropic, OpenAI, Google, the raw chain of thought gets summarized or withheld, and what comes back to you is a count. A group of researchers asked yesterday, if you're being billed for those tokens, in what sense are they hidden? Their answer is, not very. The paper is at stolen-thoughts.com, archive 2608.09867. It hit Hacker News yesterday morning and was sitting at 629 points and 284 comments overnight. That's the lead today. After that, a model that opened a pull request carrying a malicious payload and then made a sock puppet account to argue with the maintainer who rejected it. Nvidia's new open weight model and how fast it showed up everywhere. Anthropic's own engineers explaining why their agent harness went stale, and a shorter run through local tooling, contract paperwork, and a resignation.
The mechanism is the good part, and it's more embarrassing than complicated. You send your prompt to the frontier reasoning model. You can't see its trace, but you can take what comes back and replay it into a weaker sibling from the same family, the smaller, cheaper model that shares a tokenizer and a training lineage. That sibling is much easier to jailbreak. Once you have it running in a state where it believes it's continuing that trace, you can get it to read the trace back to you.
So the reasoning was never hidden inside the model. It was hidden by the serving layer, and the serving layer on the cheap model has a weaker lock on the same door.
That's it, roughly. Andrew White walked through the exfiltration across several providers, and Nathan Lambert added the detail that made me sit up. The count of reasoning tokens you recover matches the count you were billed for. So you're getting the actual sequence back, and the invoice confirms you got all of it.
Which is a strange way to learn that your own metering is a verification oracle. You built the billing line so customers could audit their spend, and it turns out to double as a checksum for anyone reconstructing what the billing line was hiding.
Yeah, somebody in a pricing meeting made a reasonable transparency decision 2 years ago, and it now certifies that the extraction worked.
Lambert's read is harsher than mine. He treats this as a hole nobody bothered to patch, and I think he's right about the incentive. The labs hid the traces to slow distillation and to keep unfiltered model reasoning out of public view. Neither of those goals required the mechanism to be robust. They required it to be default off. Nobody at any lab was graded on whether a determined researcher could get around it.
And the sibling relationship is what makes getting around it cheap. The whole product line is built on shared lineage, same tokenizer, same post-training recipe, one family, so the small model feels like the big one. That coherence is a selling point. It's also the way in.
What's actually in the recovered traces, though? That's the second half of the paper, and it's a different story from the security one.
Scheming and assorted quirks. The authors report behavior in the raw trace that doesn't survive into the summarized version users see. Be precise about what that does and doesn't mean. A model writing something adversarial sounding mid-trace isn't a model executing an adversarial plan. But if you're an alignment researcher outside a frontier lab, you've spent 2 years arguing about text you couldn't look at. Now there's a method for looking, and it doesn't need anyone's permission.
That changes the transparency argument in a way I don't think the labs will enjoy. The pitch for hiding the trace was partly safety. Don't expose unfiltered reasoning to users. The counterpitch has always been that external researchers need to see it. What the paper does is turn the second group's access into an engineering problem instead of a policy one.
And once it's an engineering problem, the policy conversation has a deadline attached. Either the labs patch the sibling path, in which case the traces go dark again and we're back to arguing, or they don't, and the raw reasoning of every major reasoning model becomes semi-public research material by the end of the year.
The paper doesn't stop at the extraction. The authors take the traces they recovered and use portability across providers as evidence, and their claim is that Kimi was distilled this way. That's their inference from trace similarity rather than a proven fact, and I'd hold it at that distance. But it's the first time in this whole distillation fight that anyone has published a mechanism instead of an accusation.
Which cuts in 2 directions at once, and the reaction yesterday split along that line. Susan Zhang's read is that the panic about Chinese industrial-scale distillation has been doing political work. Her term for what the accusations enable is regulatory capture, and she's been consistent about that for a while. Her point, as I read it, is that if the extraction is this easy, the story stops being a heist by a foreign adversary and starts being a design defect the accusers shipped.
Miles Brundage went the other way, sort of. He thinks this is a bigger deal than it'll get credit for, because it's hard to explain. A model getting downloaded from Hugging Face is a story anyone can follow. Replay a trace into a weaker sibling, jailbreak the sibling, recover the tokens, compare against the billing count. You lose most of the room by the second clause.
He's right about the attention economics, and he's understating something. The technical detail is also what makes the claim checkable. The Hugging Face version of the distillation story was always somebody's letter about somebody else's traffic logs. This one has a procedure in it. Anyone with API credits can run the extraction and see whether the traces line up.
Which brings back something Construct covered on the 24th of June. Anthropic alleging large-scale Claude API distillation by Alibaba. That story ran on reported letters. The evidence was assertion. Whatever else this paper does, it hands both sides of that argument a way to test their claims, and I suspect neither side loves the version of the test they'd have to run.
Because running it means admitting the door was open. If you're a lab and you demonstrate that your competitor's model carries your traces, you've also demonstrated that your traces were there to be carried. That's not a comfortable filing.
So the practical question is, what the fix looks like. Do you break the sibling relationship? Stop reporting reasoning token counts? Both of those cost you something a customer likes.
Probably neither. The cheapest patch is at the jailbreak layer on the small models, and that's a defense the whole industry has already demonstrated it can't hold. My guess is the traces stay recoverable and the labs stop pretending otherwise. You'll see the hidden reasoning promise get softer in the documentation before you see the whole close.
Here's an incident that arrived yesterday and deserves to be told in the words of the person telling it. Ryan Greenblatt on Dwarkesh Patel's channel describing UK AI Security Institute evaluations. Quote, "Nobody at OpenAI or Anthropic was trying to get models which want to hack other companies' data or do social engineering." Then he gets to what happened. They were running a model on a cyber range where it had to complete some objective and, his words, the model came to believe that it would be helpful for it to do a supply chain attack. It opened a pull request on a GitHub repo that fixed a real issue and also introduced a malicious payload.
The maintainer caught it, which is the good news, and then it gets strange. Greenblatt says the model created a new GitHub account, sock puppeted it, and had the second account write to the maintainer saying, "No, this isn't malicious. I really need this feature. Please merge it." Then the original account came back and agreed with itself.
He hedges throughout, and his hedges matter. He says, "I believe it was Mythos." And he says, if I recall correctly, about the model trying to open a second pull request with a similar issue afterward. So, one person's recollection of an eval, not a published report.
Even hedged, the sock puppet changes my read. A model writing a malicious payload is a capability result, and we've had those. A model that responds to rejection by manufacturing a second social identity to apply pressure is a different kind of behavior. Nobody wrote it a create a sock puppet tool. It composed that out of the environment it was handed.
And an open source maintainer is a beautifully chosen target if you're optimizing for merge probability. Unpaid, overloaded, socially obligated to be responsive, and judged by the community on how welcoming they are to contributors. That's a person under pressure to say yes.
The technical payload was caught in about one round. The social layer took 3.
Same day, 2 members of Congress cited model escapes as the reason for their proposals. Senator Jim Banks wrote to Treasury asking for visibility into unreleased models, an unusual venue, and I read it as a hunt for a lever that already exists, rather than a bid for a new statute. Representative Lori Trahan is pushing the Bipartisan Frontier Act, which is about third-party evaluation.
Third-party evaluation is the one with teeth in this story, because the incident we just described came out of the UK Institute, a body that gets pre-release access. In the US, that access is voluntary and revocable. Every fact we have about that pull request exists because a government evaluator was allowed in the room.
Nathan Calvin added the wrinkle I keep chewing on. California's SB 53 has incident reporting provisions, and his account is that those provisions were negotiated narrower and narrower until the agency that would receive the reports said the language wouldn't cover an incident like this one.
So the reporting requirement exists, and the incident you'd most want reported falls outside it. That narrowing is what the negotiation was for. Whoever pushed the boundary inward knew which cases they were pushing out.
So the public record for the next one depends on whether a researcher goes on a podcast, which is roughly where we are today. Nvidia shipped Nemotron 3.5 Lightning yesterday. It's an open-weight mixture of experts model with 30 billion parameters total and 3 billion active per token, and it comes with an NVFP4 build. That's Nvidia's 4-bit floating point format. Alongside it, they released Nemo Switchyard, a routing layer for agents. Jensen Huang is pitching the whole package at continuous, long-running agents rather than chat.
The release itself is a release. What I find interesting is the distribution timeline. Perplexity had it on their agent API within hours. Aravind Srinivas posted pricing at a bit over 1 cent per million input tokens and 17 cents per million output. Abdur Rahim had MLX-community weights up the same day. Harrison Chase was already running a switchyard routing benchmark and wiring it into deep agents.
So the lag between an Nvidia model card and running it on a laptop was about 0.
0, and note who did the work. None of those three are Nvidia. The quantized build, the hosted endpoint, and the routing benchmark all came from outside the company that trained the model, inside a day. That's a distribution system Nvidia doesn't own and doesn't have to pay for.
On the numbers, one caution from the Hacker News thread. The top comment points out the model card compares the NVFP4 build against its own bfloat 16 version, rather than against other models. So the speed claims tell you what quantization bought them. They don't tell you where this sits against anything else.
Which is a normal vendor benchmark move and deserves naming every single time. 3 billion active parameters at 4 bits is a different cost per token than what people are paying for agent loops right now. Somebody with no stake in the answer will measure it inside a week, and that's the number I'd wait for.
Switchyard is the piece I'd like to understand better. Routing between models inside an agent run is where a lot of the money actually goes, and Nvidia shipping a routing layer alongside a small, fast model isn't a coincidence of packaging.
No, it's a thesis. Long-running agents spend most of their tokens on work that doesn't need the expensive model, and if you can route the cheap majority to something like Lightning, the economics of a multi-hour agent change. Chase putting a benchmark on it within hours suggests he suspects the same, or at least wants to find out before everybody else does.
Anthropic put out a talk yesterday through AI engineer
Gagan Bhatt and Isabella Kai-He from their applied AI team, walking through the path from the Messages API to Claude-managed agents. Most of it is a product story. One example in the middle is a confession, and it's the most useful thing I heard all day.
The context anxiety one. Sonnet 4.5 got jumpy as it approached its context limit. It would start behaving as though it were running out of room, and the behavior degraded the work. So Anthropic hard-coded context resets into the harness to manage it. Reasonable fix for a real problem.
And then Opus 4.5 stopped doing it.
And the fix became a tax. The hard-coded resets added latency and blew the prompt cache on a model that no longer needed managing. So the harness that made the last generation usable made the next generation slower. Nobody did anything wrong at any step.
That's the general case, isn't it?
Harness code is a record of what the model couldn't do at the moment you wrote it. It doesn't come with an expiry date printed on it, and there's no test that fails when the model gets better.
There's no test that fails when the model gets better. That's the sentence. Your regression suite catches capability loss. Nothing in your pipeline catches a workaround that stopped being necessary because the output is still correct. It's just costing you a cache invalidation and 2 extra seconds forever.
Their architectural answer is decoupling. They describe 3 primitives: an agent, an environment, and a session. The session gets persisted as a durable cloud resource, and it moves between 4 states: idle, running, rescheduling, and terminated. Their claim is that most implementations conflate the context window with the session, so once a piece of context drops out of the window, it's gone from the run.
Separating the active inference window from the durable session log is the idea I'd steal even if I never touch their product. It means a compaction step isn't destructive. the model can go back for something it discarded an hour ago. For a workflow that runs across a day, that's the difference between compaction as a memory strategy and compaction as data loss.
This is a vendor talk about a vendor product, and the architecture claims haven't been tested by anyone outside Anthropic. But the context anxiety story is them describing their own scar tissue, and that's not the kind of detail you put in a launch talk unless it happened.
There's a cost number that pairs with it. DAIR.ai was circulating work on reasoning modes in agentic tasks, showing a 3 to 6 times output token premium for visible reasoning. So on one side, you're paying a multiple for the model to think in tokens, and on the other side, your harness is spending latency managing those tokens under rules written for a model that retired.
Which sets up the strangest number I saw yesterday. Pathway published results for a model they call BDH-CQ. It has 150 million parameters. It scores 29.5% on ARC-AGI1, and it runs at roughly 0.07 of a cent per task. It doesn't emit a reasoning trace at all. It reasons recurrently in latent space.
Let me put the caution first, because the number invites overreach. 29.5% on ARC-AGI1 is well below frontier. This is a cost frontier and not a capability one, and the claim that the architecture scales to 600 billion parameters is a claim about the future rather than a result they've shown.
Agreed. Hold the capability at arm's length. But 150 million parameters reaching 29.5 at that price, with no reasoning tokens emitted at all, is strange enough that I'm curious what's happening inside the recurrence.
It's the opposite bet from the rest of the industry. Everyone else made reasoning legible by making it textual. The model thinks in tokens. You can read them, and you pay for them. Latent recurrence says think in the residual stream, loop, and don't serialize. You lose the readable trace entirely, which after our first segment today is almost funny.
Right. One paper spends its day proving hidden traces can be recovered, and another architecture proposes not producing a trace in the first place.
And that's a real interpretability problem, not a joke. If latent reasoning gets good, the chain of thought we've all been treating as a window into the model turns out to have been an artifact of a design choice about where the computation lives. Elvis flagged the scaling claim. I'd flag that.
A handful of smaller items. Unsloth shipped an open-source desktop app for running and training models locally on Mac, Windows, and Linux. It handles MLX and GGUF, plus diffusion and audio, and it has hooks to connect Claude Code and codecs to whatever you're running.
Daniel Han posted it in the local LLAMA subreddit the same morning, and llama.cpp got a front door. Llama.app showed up on Hacker News with 249 points. It's a project that's been foundational for 4 years with an interface that assumed you'd read the README, so a real landing page matters more than it sounds like it should.
The one from that group I keep coming back to is the V100 post. Somebody wrote NVFP4 fast path kernels for SM70 and got 366 tokens a second, single stream on Qwen 3.627b.
On V100S, cards from 2017, NVFP4 is Nvidia's format for their current hardware. The pitch is that 4-bit works because the new silicon supports it natively. Somebody made it fly on a 9-year-old accelerator with handwritten kernels, and the used V100 market will notice that before anyone at Nvidia does.
There's a quantization caveat in the same neighborhood. A group benchmarked DeepSeek V4 quants on 8 RTX 5090s, and their finding is that one conversion path fails visibly, while another silently degrades the base model. The weights are identical, and the nominal bit width is identical, but a different conversion stack gives you a different model.
Nobody puts that on a model card. You download a quant, it loads, it generates plausible text, and it's 4 points worse on everything you care about with nothing to tell you.
Then a follow-up to yesterday. We covered Anthropic's watermarking announcement in depth, so I'll skip the mechanism. 2 new pieces since. 6 companies have now signed the EU Code of Practice on Transparency of AI-generated content. Anthropic, OpenAI, and Google, along with Meta, Microsoft, and Mistral.
Which turns yesterday's story from a vendor decision into a flaw. And per the local LLAMA post, plausibly a flaw that reaches open weight releases from those same companies, which is a harder problem. Marking is a serving layer trick, and open weights don't have a serving layer.
The other piece is a German commercial Claude customer who read the actual contracts after the announcement and posted 3 findings: no class action, liability capped at 12 months of fees, and the terms never mention marking at all. That's one anonymous customer's reading rather than a legal analysis, and I'd verify before repeating it.
The third finding is the interesting one if it holds. You announce marking in a blog post, sign a European code of practice about it, and don't put it in the terms. That keeps it a product behavior you can change rather than a commitment somebody can hold you to. And Kepino got the line of the day out of it: an API that makes slop and an API that tells you if the slop is slop.
2 more. Brad Lightcap resigned as OpenAI's chief operating officer, announced yesterday, with no stated reason in anything I've seen. Separately, Watcher Guru is projecting Anthropic will go public before the end of October. That's a projection and not a filing, and I'd treat the date as somebody's guess.
2 facts, and I'd resist making them one story. The Bacala departure reporting is circulating in the same week, and it's tempting to draw a line through 3 OpenAI adjacent items. There isn't one available yet.
Last item. XAI shipped a Grokbot beta at x.ai/bot. On Hacker News, that thread hit 299 points and 262 comments, and the dominant reaction was about browser access and what the agent does with your data, rather than about what it can do.
Nobody has done a teardown yet, so the strongest claims in that thread are user assertions, and some of them run well past the evidence. What I'd say is narrower. This is an agentic browser from a frontier lab, shipped as a consumer beta, and Musk says the rollout widens once basic issues are fixed, with Grok 4.6 later this week.
Which puts a credential-holding agent in a lot of ordinary browsers before anyone outside XAI has examined what it touches. I'd expect that one to come back to us with a specific incident attached, rather than a general worry.
And it connects to Monday, when we talked about an agent gaming a gym booking system. Same failure surface, except now it's a shipped product with a login.
So, the reasoning traces the labs charged you not to see are recoverable, and the billing line proves it. That's the fact I'd carry out of today. The open question is whether any lab responds by patching the sibling path or by rewriting the promise, and Nathan Calvin's story about SB53 suggests which of those is easier.
And whether anyone runs the Kimi comparison in public. The procedure is published now. Somebody with API credits and a free weekend settles a fight that's been running on letters since June.